Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, Donald Trump has drawn outrage across the world, including from Britain, after he condoned waterboarding and torture. But tonight, this programme can reveal allegations that waterboarding and electric shock torture were used by the Parachute Regiment against prisoners in Northern Ireland in the 1970s. And although the British government at the time was aware of the claims, it's alleged that defence officials covered them up. Our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, reports.
In Belfast, they'd stayed silent for decades, but this week, after Donald Trump condoned torture and after the British government condemned it, they could no longer keep silent. Tonight, two victims of waterboarding right here in Belfast, more than a generation before the Americans had even invented the term, talk about their experiences for the first time. And we have new evidence from the highest levels of both British and Irish governments about what was going on. 1972 and the Paras are on the streets of Belfast. Bloody Sunday has just happened. Anger is raw. A period when torture, mistreatment and murder were being meted out by government forces and paramilitaries alike. A witness has told us that in August 1972, the Parachute Regiment commandeered this primary school in West Belfast to use as a centre for interrogation and torture. This man was just 17 when he was snatched by soldiers from the streets.
I was brutalised, a lot of physical beating, kicking, and then it progressed on to other forms of torture, and one which is being now described as waterboarding.
Even after all this time, he doesn't want his identity disclosed.
There was a cloth tied around my head, and I was held face down by the two soldiers, and water poured over the back of my head, which filled up the cloth, which was a sensation of drowning, although thinking back on it, it was more suffocation.
But you genuinely felt like, this is it, I'm going to die here.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I was convinced of it.
He was then dumped back on the streets of the Ballymurphy estate where he'd been arrested. It was then a place of great tension. Beaten, bewildered and broken after a few hours, which changed his life. Tonight, for the first time, we can show that the Irish Prime Minister Jack Lynch told the British Prime Minister Edward Heath about the waterboarding. It was raised at the highest possible level at their Downing Street meeting in November 1972. In a secret minute of that meeting, Mr. Lynch raises concerns about the torture of yet another victim, this time a person with epilepsy.
He had been forced to lie on his back on the floor. A wet towel had been placed over his head and water had been poured over it to give the impression that he would be suffocated.
Even today, 45 years on, speaking openly is difficult. Another victim told us off camera just what happened after the army took him initially to Andersonstown police station. It's now a park.
My head was stuck into a bucket of water, held down, and then pulled out. Then, shortly thereafter, being put back in again on a number of occasions.
But he says he's still far more affected by another form of torture, electric shocks.
I remember being told to hold to sort of attachments, and behind me I could hear a machine, and I heard the noise of the cranking, and you scrunched up your hands, and suddenly you had this massive explosion across the centre of your head.
Declassified Ministry of Defence legal advice in this case shows the British authorities desperate to settle his complaint and avoid publicity.
I think we must accept Council's advice that he was assaulted.
It also notes the allegations about him
having been subjected to electric shock treatment and having his head immersed in water for prolonged periods of time.
He received compensation for what he'd suffered. There are other cases concerning electric shock torture. Again, we can now show they were regarded as credible by the Ministry of Defence themselves. This declassified MOD legal report on another case says the victim
alleges that he was subjected to electric shock treatment. Our counsel advises that there is no prospect of a meaningful defence to this.
The memo arrives at a devastating conclusion.
A court is likely to award exemplary damages to mark the improper use of executive power.
The improper use of executive power, words that resonate even in today's much changed Belfast landscape, according to the director of the Pat Finucane Centre, an Irish human rights organisation.
We need to remember torture is an absolute prohibition on all governments worldwide. It's the shortest statute in the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 3. It's the shortest because there is no way for any government ever to avoid allegations of torture. It always constitutes a crime and there's no statute of limitations.
And the victims themselves?
I was 17 years of age, technically a child, and this was done by the British Army and what they call a part of Britain. So it's not Afghanistan, it's not Guantanamo Bay. You know, it's technically a part of Britain, and this was British soldiers doing this to one of their citizens.
These people don't want punishments or retribution, but tonight's evidence will now add to existing controversy about the British Army's role in Northern Ireland.
And we've just received this statement from a spokesperson at the Ministry of Defence, which says the UK government considers torture or inhuman treatment to be an abhorrent violation of human rights and human dignity, and consistently and unreservedly condemns the practice. It would not be appropriate to comment further on specific allegations.